Amen. What a great song for us to sing and to bring ourselves closer to God through that praise and worship. We're thankful so much for your attendance tonight. We look forward to spending time after worship, obviously, and we're so grateful for you. And now for this time to study together. We're going to be in Song of Solomon. We'll be in chapter 8, Song of Solomon chapter 8, and we'll begin in verse number 5 in just a moment. Don and I sometimes like to talk about watches. He's kind of a watch guy, and my dad has always been a watch guy, and there are 3 brands in the Swiss watch world that are just high above all the other brands. And so their dollar figures are just almost untouchable. And one of those 3 is a family-run, independent business called Patek Philippe. And so you talk about the most desired watches, the most expensive watches, a third of them or more are Pateks, all right? I guess that's more the right syllabification, Pateks. And so, like, for instance, the silver one there on the right, I think it retails for around $50,000, but even if you had that much money, you couldn't walk in and buy it. You would need to buy it in the aftermarket, and it would be 2 to 3 times that amount. So just incredible amount of zeros there. 25 years ago, they released a marketing campaign that was featured around this statement, and they don't update it because it's so effective and so good for them. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. The idea is you're buying a family heirloom. And we're recognizing for the people that they're appealing to with that kind of money, they're saying, if you're going to invest in a family heirloom, this much money, we want to be the ones you do that with. You're not buying a watch for you. You're buying a watch to pass down this story, all right? So just putting aside the kind of materialistic aspect of that kind of an industry and those kind of dollar figures, think about the principle of investing in things that last. Investing in things that can be passed down generationally on down the line. How much has that suffered in the most important things of life, not just material goods, but how much has that suffered in our age of instant gratification? And one thing after another, and one thing wears out and we just replace it. One thing begins to not be the right fit, and so we just replace it. I was talking with a sports coach that I know quite well, and he said what's fascinating is just to see this unhealthy trickling up effect of especially travel ball. Boys, girls, doesn't matter, sport doesn't matter. They're all prone to do this, where they allow their kids to just test it out. And if it's a good fit, then great. But if it's not a good fit, we'll find another team. We'll find the best team that just seems to make you feel good and gives you the right amount of playing time and all that. And so they said, it's not trickling down from the NFL or from the NBA downward. It's actually trickling up. That parents are enabling just this mindset that says, try it out. If you don't like it, find another one. So can we think of more sacred, more significant relationships where that mindset might continue to leak and cause harm and danger, impact us away from the Lord? Clearly, it's having an impact even when it comes to the sacred institution of marriage. If it's not a good fit, if it doesn't work out, then perhaps you can find another fit, another better fit. There was an article in Fox News several years ago. Here was the title: "Some seek alternatives to 'Till Death Do Us Part.'" So with changing perspective toward marriage, they want vows that reflect that possibility. And I'm only reading this to set up what a psychologist would say on the positive about this, okay? So here's a section from the article. Vows like, for as long as we continue to love each other, for as long as our love shall last, until our time together is over, are increasingly replacing the traditional to the grave vow, a switch that some call realistic and others call a recipe for failure. Now, in the same article, a psychologist weighs in, not a religious officiant, not someone with a religious background that I know of. So this psychologist chimes in and says this. Her name is Diana Kirshner. She's arguing for the need to have this till death do us part mindset toward marriage. Over time, your mate brings out the best in you, but also the worst in you. So you have to have a contract that you'll work together to help each other grow. A contract is that kind of a thing. As long as we feel good, there's a guarantee, though, that you'll feel bad. you'll hit a rocky point where you don't love anyone. You don't even love yourself. So her point was, and she says this, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where active love comes through. I thought that was pretty insightful from a psychologist. I don't know anything about her. I didn't realize I put that on the screen. There you go. Thanks, Cole. You were paying attention better than I was. But that last line from a psychologist saying, the till death do us part in our marriage vows is crucial, because that's when active love steps in to say, no, I said till death do us part. So I'm going to do everything in my power to keep it till death do us part. As we come to a close of studying the Song of Solomon, our aim is simply to do what God says to do, Hebrews 13, verse 4, to let marriage be held in honor among all. The more we live in a culture and a society where sexual immorality and those passions take over, it's not a surprise that marriage would be what suffers. And this book elevates the beauty of marriage, and it does it in a respectful way. It does it in a way that is memorable and poetic. This poetry and these visual images would have no doubt helped the original audiences and these young men and young women who are hearing these poems to have called them to memory, to put them on a storyline, a narrative arc in a memorable way to help them. As we review before we read chapter 8, remember that chapters 1 through the early part of chapter 3 are the whole dating process, what we might even call courting. They're attracted to each other in right ways. They learn each other. They exercise restraint because they know that's the will of God. And they cultivate the relationship deeply. But then you see the wedding. You see the honeymoon phase in chapter 4 and early chapter 5. But then they have conflict. There's no perfect marriage. But there is the path with the Lord to reconciliation. Chapter 7 shows the deepening romance. And then we get to chapter 8 tonight that we're going to notice is kind of this bow on the whole story. The Hebrew language, and especially Hebrew poetry, is big on parallelism. So how you end reflects how you began. So a lot of the details that we found in chapter 1 and chapter 2 are going to be pulled back in at the very end of chapter 8, especially to remind us how we can anchor ourselves to the Lord such that our marriages last till death do us part. Let's notice this first idea from verses 5 through 7 about how our marriages can be a true love story. It's good to have a true love story, but God makes it possible and shows us how to have a true love story. Song of Solomon 8, verse 5. This is her talking and pointing her gaze toward him. Who is that coming up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? Under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she who bore you was in labor. Now that goes back to his childhood and his birth, and we're not going to get into any of that, but just notice the beginning of verse 5. She's looking and seeing herself next to him. All right? Now verse 6. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. Now pause for a moment. Let's talk about that imagery. The importance of a seal back in those days was of utmost importance. It was your identity, but it was also ownership. You put your brand on something. You do the seal into wax, and it hardens, and it's going to stay there until someone breaks it. And so she is saying to my husband, put me as a seal on your very heart. I want to be the source of cooperative, mutual belonging to each other. I want your heart completely. But then she says, and as a seal upon your arm. The arms were obviously highly important in military. Show off your strength, your muscles, those kinds of things. And that often wear bands around their arms of gold and precious jewels. And so she's saying, I want to see my belonging to you, even to your arms. And so one preacher that I know has said about this statement or this verse, when the heart is loyal, so too will the arm be loyal. See the order? She says, I want your heart. I want your inside, I want your commitment, and I want your outsides. I want your arms. And so that's what she's asking for from him, from her husband. And here's why she says this. This is probably the most significant and most well-known verse in the whole book. Here's why. For love is strong as death. Jealousy is fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire. the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. So she says, I want to see evidence of our belonging, our mutual sacrificial love. Why? Because that kind of love is as strong as death and as strong as fire that cannot be quenched. Now, let's break those down quickly. Those are both things that consume, that draw them in. They're also things that are final, that are lasting. I think I do have that up here on the screen. Man, death and fire, neither one give back. Once you dig the grave and you put your pet in the grave, you can't get the pet back. Once a human being dies, you can't get the human being back. Death is once and for all. You can't take back death. And likewise, you put a piece of wood into a fire, it's pretty much too late. You don't reach in and grab it back out. You put a piece of paper and you made a mistake and it was too valuable and you wish you hadn't have put it in the fire, but it's final. It doesn't give back. So the overall point is she is recognizing through the course of their relationship being led by God, nothing is more powerful than true love. And notice the specificity she says at the end of verse 6. The very flame of the Lord. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we noticed that chapter 5 and verse 1 is, some consider it might be the actual words of God speaking, telling them to enjoy the fruits of their marriage in the honeymoon phase. But here, chapter 8 and verse number 6 is the only time the name of God, the name of the Lord, is referenced in the entire book. And it's about the invincibility, the strength of true love that comes from God. Nothing is more powerful than true love that comes from the Lord. So how powerful is it? Well, you take those flames, many waters cannot quench them. You're reminiscent of Elijah on Mount Carmel. All the extra water, God's fire lapped it all up. Well, the reverse is true here. You've got a true love, burning as a fire. And no matter how much water is cast upon it, it doesn't put out that fire. So when both parties in a marriage are drawing nearer to the Lord to find out what true agape love is, and they're both drawing to each other out of that agape love, many waters, many circumstances, many mistakes, many harsh words cannot quench the true love that comes from God. And then he says this at the end of verse number 7, or she says this: if a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. See, because it is so powerful, it's invaluable. You can't take a price for it. If somebody came along and said, well, I'll give you X amount for your spouse, see, that would be offensive to ever consider it. That kind of love that can't be quenched, can't be exchanged for anything else. And so as we think about all the possible distractions and all the possible competitors to this kind of love, none of them ever approach being as valuable as the true love that we find when we seek the Lord. Now, we'll kind of skip ahead to past some slides just out of sake of time, but let's notice the next section, though, all right? She has this understanding through the course of their relationship together. Look how strong true love is. Now, here's where the story gets so great from a narrative arc perspective, all right? She's going to go back to her childhood and revisit some details, and this comes full circle. So notice, it's just titled Others above verse number 8, all right? So it's in the perspective of her brothers, okay? She's under the care of her brothers, maybe because her dad has died, maybe because he's older. We don't know those reasons, but she's in the care of her brothers. So here's what they say, verse 8. We have a little sister. She has no breasts. She's young. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? She's young, and we're thinking ahead about the day in which someone wants to marry her. How do we prepare her for marriage? That's the question. Parents, do we have that question? How do we prepare our children for marriage? Well, here's their plan. Verse number 9. If she is a wall, we will build on her a battlement of silver. if she has followed through with that perspective earlier where she says, don't awaken love until it pleases, then we're going to continue to build her up because she has chosen wisely. And she has chosen from the Lord to keep herself pure for Him and for her husband thus. But then they say this, if she is a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. If she's gone outside of those restraints and she's been with men before marriage, then we need to build her up in a different way. We need to protect her in such a way that she will then be drawn back to that level of restraint. You see their wisdom? They're preparing her for a life of commitment by showing her, investing in her in such a way that she will exercise restraint even before marriage comes. So here's her answer, verse number 10. She's telling Solomon all of this. Listen to how full circle this is coming. That's her point. I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers. I grew old, remained a wall. Then I was in his eyes as one who finds peace. We don't get what she's doing in the English. Verse 10. What's the very next word that she says? Look at verse 11. It was in his eyes as one who finds peace. All right, I'd restrained myself. I'd kept myself pure for God and for my husband. So the Lord gave me peace. Now look at verse 11. What's the very next word? Solomon, his name. What's the Hebrew word for peace? Anybody know? Shalom. Same exact root as Solomon. Solomon, the name comes from the name peace, the word peace. So she is saying, because I had committed myself to God, God gave me Solomon. Gave me the man that I needed. And so she was ready for marriage because she was spiritually mature. She had said, I would rather stay single and obey God than to have a man and compromise my commitment to God. And how do we know that to be the case? This detail becomes important because back in chapter 1, she says, I don't know, Solomon, I'm dark. You might not like the way I look. I've had to work in the field. I'm not like one of your fancy rich women that you could find who's pale because they get to stay inside all the time. All right, remember that detail. Because here's what happens. Let's read verse 11. Very next word was Solomon. Okay, Solomon had a vineyard at Baal-Hamon. He let out the vineyard to keepers. Each one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, my very own, is before me. You, O Solomon, may have the 1,000, and the keepers of the fruit 200. So remember why she was dark? Because she had to go to work for her brothers in the vineyard. Who had the brothers? Who were they working the vineyard for? For Solomon. Solomon owned the vineyard. They were kind of working out a lease to work the vineyard. And they said, hey, sister, you got to come help us carry this load. That's why she had dark skin and she was self-conscious. But that's also when she met Solomon. See the hand of the Lord working providentially through her commitment first of her restraint, but second because of her understanding of authority. That she grew up in a home where she respected her brothers. And because she did what they had her to do and she trusted them and she trusted the Lord, God gave her her peace, her man, her Solomon. See the beauty of this Lord's love story when God is involved and God is behind it all, working them together to find each other. It's interesting. We would be prone to think, well, the son of David, well, surely he has all the opportunities and surely he's going to have all of God's providence and blessings at play. But of the two, it seems pretty clear she was raised in a home that was emphasizing more this concept of restraint and purity. Solomon had a lot of baggage with his dad in that regard. So we praise God for this great account to see her restraint and her purity and her character also now being seen in how the Lord brought them together. And so we learn from this that the best place to go to build a marriage, the best place to go to rebuild, to find reconciliation is always to the Lord. It's always the first step. But notice what they did in closing this book up. She's also going back to their beginning and connecting their beginning to the Lord. We want to know a path for strengthening our relationships. It's to not wait till our anniversary every year to kind of reminisce and go back to that day, but to revisit our beginning, to revisit why we, quote, love each other and the Lord's hand in bringing us together and our seeking of the Lord together. We can follow their lead and always turning toward God for strength, no matter how long we have been married. All right, let's look at the last two verses. This is him speaking. Verse 13, "O you who dwell in the gardens, with companions listening for your voice, let me hear it." This is his final words in the entire book. And he says, you have your friends, and when you're with them, a lot of people want to hear you. A lot of people want your attention. But I want you to know I'm listening. Solomon says, of all the things that I'm going to wrap up our poetic description of our lives together, this is it. I want to listen to you. Man, there's probably not a stronger thing we could do for our wives than to just simply say, I'm here for you. How can I listen? How can I help? Look at the very last verse, verse 14. She says this, "Make haste, my beloved, be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of spices." Those are terms that have to do with his strength and even kind of teetering into this sexual side of the relationship. But our overall point is, come rescue me. Come being the man who keeps delivering me. I want to see you and your enthusiasm coming home from work, coming home from the gardens, coming home from the fields with your sheep, coming home from battle. I want to see you come rescue me. So she is making herself available to him for companionship, for enjoyment. Willard Harley wrote a book several years ago that a lot of people reference called His Needs, Her Needs. These two verses essentially do what that whole book does. He is making himself available based on how God made women. He is saying, I know you need companionship that comes from communication, and I'm available to listen to you. And she likewise is doing the same based on how God made men. God made men to want to desire this physical touch, this companionship, this conquering of life together. And I'm here to go through life in that capacity with you. So there's an enduring love that goes back to their beginning, recognizing the hand of God in it all, and then saying, I'm here. And I'm always here. I'm here with you, and I'm here for you. If both would have maintained that unselfishness, that humble spirit of turning toward one another's needs, they'll of course always find those needs being met. And likewise, the same for us. There's a parable in certain kind of business circles or self-help circles, you might say, just about finding the purpose of life. It's about 3 different bricklayers all working on the same project. You may have heard it. You ask one bricklayer, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm laying bricks. I've got a job, and I'm making money by laying bricks. You ask the second bricklayer, what's he doing? He says, well, I'm building a great cathedral. He's got a project in mind, and he's setting out to have an accomplishment. And the third one says, I'm building the house of God. I've got a greater purpose even beyond this physical thing. And the idea is that's the true measure of success, when you can see the big picture of what you're doing and how it connects. You remember the same author of Song of Solomon. The groom in this story is the same one who wrote Psalm 127. That psalm opens by saying, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor build it in vain. So what a place to begin, or what a place to revisit, or what a place to visit for the first time in our marriages if we never have. Then to be able to say, when it comes to what we're building in this house, we're building the house of God. This is not just our marriage. This is not my marriage. This is God's marriage. He's the one who created it. He's the one who's brought us together. He's the one who's, quote, joined us together. And we're not going to let any waters come upon it to put it asunder. So what if we just keep talking about great stories of success when it comes to marriages that last, quote, till death do us part? I wanted to be sure to include a positive news story just kind of to balance the opening that was negative. There's a couple that as of 2014, I couldn't find an update since then, but as of 2014, they had said I do in some sort of a wedding ceremony 109 times. In 1986, they got married officially, kind of legally. They had a family wedding at a church building soon after. And then they had kind of a fun wedding for themselves, I think, out in Las Vegas. And so they had 3 quick weddings, exchanging of vows and saying I do within a short amount of time. And so they had the thought, I wonder what the world record is for saying I do. They figured out it was like 56, 57. So it took them 19 years of finding a different place, a unique place to renew their vows and to say I do. They eventually eclipsed that and went on to 109 at least. That's a fun love story, isn't it? To say, I want to keep saying I do. I want to keep saying that there's nothing going to stand in the way of us. Here's what she said. Lauren Blair is her name. We just really love each other. And David, he loves looking into my eyes and saying, yes, I want to marry you again. It's kind of as simple as that. And then finding the courage to let that carry us through the challenges. Keep turning back to God, to let His stories of love guide us in our stories together. A couple of quick takeaways tonight for us. How do we move forward with this? How do we do what God says to hold marriage in high esteem among us all? If you're married here tonight and you're married, just tell your spouse, maybe even before bed tonight, I'm committed. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You're mine. I'm yours. Maybe you told them yesterday. Maybe you've told them today already. We cannot hear it often enough. But number 2, look around this room, look around the church directory, across the church directory, and you see some couples that have been married and modeled longevity. Would you tell them thank you? Thank you for your love that hasn't been quenched. Likewise, look around the room and across the directory for some newly married couples. You've got what it takes. The Lord will sustain you when you will turn toward Him. Reach out to encourage them. And number 4, reach out and encourage someone who is a widow or a widower, someone who truly lived out the death do us part. And say thank you. I remember so fondly your spouse and y'all's relationship. That just continues to bring us together and gives us these hooks to hang our own lives and our own marriages, our own relationships upon as we seek the Lord and His blessing on our homes. The first step, the best step that any of us can make for our marriages is to ensure that we are right with the Lord. If you're not a Christian, we'd love to help you become one. We'd love to open up the Word of God to let Him show us clearly how to take that step, to have an obedient faith and trust in Him. So we'd love to talk with you. We'd love to assist you in making that decision tonight. If you're ready to put Him on in baptism for the forgiveness of sins, we'd love to assist you with that tonight. Or maybe you need to come back to Him. You've not been living a committed covenant life to Him. We'd love to see you do that. He's there to help us in all of our areas of life, not just our marriages, but especially in things that can weigh us down and be sources of stress. He wants to help us when we're willing to come to Him and let Him help us bear that load. Let us know how we can help you in anything at all. Would you use this time to come to Him now as we